We are in the book of Isaiah. We are in what we're calling the second week of Advent, which some would call the first week of Advent. And I want to talk just briefly, even as we get started today, about Advent. And, you know, it's that time of waiting, that time of period of waiting for Christmas Day, for Christmas to come upon us. If you want to think about Advent in a summary way, it really is just God revealing himself to us. God reveals himself to us. If you read the Old Testament, you would see this longing and this waiting. And, you know, ever since humanity existed, we've wondered about God. We wonder, what is God like? We wonder who God is. We all have those questions, even now. Who is God? What is he like? Well, in Christmas, in the story of Advent, he begins the process, and before Jesus came, he would send people. Prophets would come. They would say what God is like. He came on a mountain and delivered the Ten Commandments, his law, and said, this is something that I'm like. This is what I desire. This is what I want. And yet, man still was in a place of difficulty. He was in a place of, as we'll read this morning, a place of darkness. And finally, God says, well, you know what? If I'm going to really show humanity what I'm like, why don't I just come? Why don't I come to the earth I created? And they won't have to ask anymore what I'm like, because they will see me. They will see what I'm like. So if you've been around here long enough, one of the favorite things I like to say is, we want to know who God is. We want to know what God has to say to us. Jesus is what God has to say. You know, he could have come and he could have sent a bunch of information to us. He could have just given us his word and described himself and given us a lot of facts about himself. But he came as a real living, breathing person. So Advent, God revealing himself to us, but he not only reveals himself to us when he reveals himself to us, because when we find out who he is and what he's like, he reorients us. It changes us. The very fact that we celebrate Christmas and that God came is meant to change us. It's meant to reorient the way we think about the world in which we live and our days and those things. So I'm going to read from the book of Isaiah. This is a prophet talking to people about their longings and their desires. The people, that's us. This is written to the people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in a land of deep darkness, on them a light has shone. You have multiplied the nation. You've increased its joy. And they rejoice before you as with joy at the harvest, as they are glad with what you brought, the divide and the spoil and the riches that you bring in our land. For the yoke of his burden and the staff for his shoulder, the rod of his oppressor, you've broken, just as in the days of Midian. And that's an Old Testament story with Gideon, a man named Gideon who came and fought, where the backs of those who were oppressing the people of God were broken. For every boot of the trampling warrior in battle, tumult, and every garment rolled in blood will be burned as fuel for fire. Those who are wreaking evil, those who are wreaking havoc, there's going to be a day when that is no more. For unto us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulders, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, the everlasting Father and the Prince of Peace. Of the increase of this wonderful Counselor, everlasting Father and Prince of Peace, the increase of that one's rule and of that one's peace, it will be forever. There will be no end. It will be on the throne of David and over his kingdom to establish it and to uphold it with justice and righteousness from this time forth and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do all of this. There is a very wordy passage from an Old Testament prophet. Christmas. Over the next few weeks, we're going to be talking about the child that was born, the one who has brought his love and his peace. And I always reflect when we have our Advent stuff, one of our Advent, actually both of these Advent banners that we put up over here that are up in the building this morning come from a hymn, O Holy Night. His law is love and his gospel is peace. And because his law is love and the good news brings peace, the people can find joy, and we can find rejoicing in this particular truth. I didn't know this. I was actually looking this up. That hymn was written at Christmas time, and I actually did a little research, and I couldn't figure out what in the world it had to do, but there was this church that was getting a brand new organ. And they were dedicating the organ, and this guy who wrote this was a poet, and he was supposed to write a poem for the huge organ dedication for a worship service that happened to be around Christmas time. What the words of that song and organ dedicate and organs have anything to do with each other, I actually don't know. But it was Christmas time, and then someone just very soon after this poem was written put it to music. And we have it today. You can go back to the first part of this slide. Christmas reminds us. It's funny because Christmas to us, and especially for me growing up, it's an extremely chaotic time of year. Now, I intentionally work to make it less chaotic for at least myself during these times. We buy gifts, we have family expectations, we go to events, we do events, we do all of these things, and in the midst of, sometimes I think that, Christmas is peace on earth. Like the last season of the year for me where it seems like there's peace on earth is Christmas. I actually think we should think about that. Christmas comes, and so we celebrate at the park, and there's lights, and there's lights that show up in the darkness. This verse reminds us, for the people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in the land of deep darkness, a light has shone on them. There's a running theme in these verses that in the midst of God's prophet coming to his people, there is this recognition that he is writing and talking to people who are in the midst of very deep darkness. That's the same word that is actually used in Psalm 23. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, this darkness is a death darkness. It's what you and I walk in. It's the world in which we live. We walk and we dwell in chaos, uncertainty, and darkness. And yet in the midst of this darkness, this prophet is prophesying in this deep, death-like darkness. By the way, this isn't a situation, if you were reading this in the book of Isaiah, it's not a situation that you would ever want to be in as a people. It's not the situation that you go look for. It's not the situation that you would envy to be in. This place of deep darkness, this place of deep chaos. Genesis 1:1, and the earth was dark and void. There was chaos. The same language is used. But in the midst of the chaos, and it's interesting because this language actually is from Genesis 1. What does it say? And the earth was without form and void. And then God spoke and there was what? Light. Now we're post-creation and something has happened to creation. Creation has somehow gone back to the point of chaos. It has gone back to the point of darkness. And guess what comes in the midst of the darkness? Light. And guess who sends the light in the midst of the darkness? God. God sends it. Dark. We're walking. We're dwelling. But in the midst of it, grace shines out. Light comes. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in the land of the deep darkness, on them a light has shone. You've multiplied the nation. You've increased its joy. They rejoice before you as with joy at the harvest. Joy to the world. Because this light has come. So if you're reading this in Isaiah's day, it is not a good time. You do have oppressors coming down you as the people of God. You are in exile. It is not looking promising to ever get out of exile. You're looking for someone to come along and give you some hope and give you some promise. Isaiah does that. And he speaks of this day when the people who are in the midst of the chaos, when the people who are in the midst of uncertainty will see this darkness, or will be walking in it, but they will see this light. The surprise of the text is the great light is a child. There's lots of ironies in this text. A child. Not the great and mighty king. Not the one that they would expect, but this infant baby child is going to come. So you can go to verse 6 because we're going to spend most of our time there. For unto us this child is born. Unto us this son is given. Who is the us? It's the people who were walking in darkness. It's the people who are expecting this great light. It's the people who are expecting this promise of great light. This one, for unto us the child is born. For unto us this son is going to be given. That this great light is actually a child. And this child, there's lots of backwards things here. This child is going to come, and the government, the rulership, will be on his shoulders. And this child's going to have some names. And those names are going to mean everything. This child, this little itty-bitty infant child, is going to be a wonderful counselor. There's no comma in there in the Greek. It's not his name is going to be wonderful and counselor. His name is going to be, he's going to be a wonderful counselor. It actually has warlike terms. That word for counselor actually has to do with strategy. He's going to be a wonderful strategist. He's going to be a wonderful planner. His name is going to be Wonderful Story Writer. Wonderful Counselor. Wonderful person who writes history stories. Who strategizes how history is going to be and what history is going to look like. And not just what history is going to look like, what your story is going to look like and what my story is going to look like. And not only planning that out, but planning it in a perfect way. The story and the strategy that he comes up with is wonderful. It's beautiful. It's glorious. He is the most wonderful story writer. And he can do that because he's the mighty God, this child. This little infant. This is stunning language, by the way. They have thoughts of Creator God and who it is. For to us, a child is born, and he's going to be the most mighty. He's going to be your mighty God. I can tell you, for all of us wonderful strategists, for all of us wonderful story writers, the story we would not have come up with is that the one who created the heavens and the earth, the one who was to be the supreme being and is the supreme being of all things, would actually show up in a manger and wear diapers. The mighty God wore diapers that needed to be changed. That's crazy. It's exactly what Isaiah is saying. You know, Isaiah was killed. History says that maybe Isaiah was like this. That the mighty God, and by the way, this mighty God looks like no other mighty God of the gods of that age. That the one who created me and you actually wore diapers. You know what? That actually sounds sacrilegious. But you and I have no hope if he didn't wear diapers. It's not sacrilegious, it's glorious. He's the everlasting Father. The everlasting Father. I always irritate the theological technicians. And the Trinity. You can't pray to Jesus. You pray to the Father in the name of Jesus. Jesus is the everlasting Father. The child is also the everlasting Father. Has everything to do with him being the most best strategist and the best counselor and the mighty God. Because if he is the eternal one, if the eternal one has come, the one that we long for and the one who is the eternal one, if he is the everlasting dad, if he is the everlasting Father, you know what that means? That all of my wisdom, and I don't know if I'll live to be 100. I don't even know if I'll live to be whatever. But say you did live to be 100. I mean, the arrogance of humanity just strikes me in this passage. He's the everlasting Father. You can't come up with anything new that he hasn't thought of, that he hasn't seen, that would surprise him, because he's everlasting. He's seen it all. He's created it all. He is the everlasting Father. He has anchored all of history. He was Abraham's father. He was Jacob's father. He was Daniel's father. He was St. Paul's father. He's my Father. He's your Father. He's the everlasting Father. And because he is the most wonderful story writer, and because the most wonderful story writer is none other than the most mighty God himself, who is not just everlasting, but he's an everlasting Father. He's not an everlasting tyrant. He's an everlasting Father, a good, good Father. Because of that, he has also become the Prince of Peace that he can truly offer to you and to me, to myself. He's the Prince of Wholeness. This is why we celebrate Advent. Do you know Jesus giggled just like Frankie did right there? And he did in Mary's arms. And you know what we would do? I'm going I'm going to pick on you right now. I'm sorry if I'm embarrassing you. Listen, sometimes maybe I shouldn't say stuff, but I'm going to anyway. Because it just made me. So Jesus was Frankie's age. Jesus giggled and goo-gooed and is learning to talk and learning to walk. And yet sometimes today, so Frankie, and Deanna knows this because she comes here, but we love kids in our worship service. Frankie isn't a nuisance to us. He's not a bother to us. I mean, imagine if that was Mary holding Jesus. Would we ask Mary to take Jesus out of the worship service because he just can't shut up? I mean, really? This one and these names. I did weep when I just read them this week. Wonderful Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, and the Prince of Peace, the Prince of Wholeness, the Prince of Completeness. This is why Jesus came. To reveal himself this week as the Wonderful Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, and the Prince of Peace. This is what history is anchored in. This is why we worship. This is why we do church. I was listening this week and I ran across this quote and I thought it was so good, even as I was kind of just in awe of Christmas and God coming to earth and what it is we do and why we worship and this thing even that we call religion. You know, if your religion, listen to how shallow we make things. If your religion is actually, if the reason you come to church, if the reason you do this religious stuff is so that you will actually be able to do better things than the person sitting next to you this morning, how weak is that? Is that your religion? So you actually get to do better things than someone else? Or is it about Advent, where the one who is the Almighty Father, the Everlasting Father, the Mighty God, the Wonderful Counselor, and the Prince of Peace has come to reorient us, to shape us, and to make us new? You know, the more I think about it, if all we are really is a bunch of people that hope to be people that get to do things better than other people, we actually end up doing horrible things to other people. But if God reveals himself in the form of a child in this way, this will reorient us. This will shape us. Listen, he's the Wonderful Counselor, this child. He's the Mighty God. He's the Everlasting Father. And he's the Prince of Peace. And guess what? The Wonderful Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, and the Prince of Peace is for you. For to you this child is born. To you the Son is given. To me this child is born. To me the Son is given. To you, the Wonderful Counselor, the Mighty God, and the Everlasting Father, and the Prince of Peace was born. To you, the Wonderful Counselor, the Mighty God, and the Everlasting Father, and the Prince of Peace was born. And you know what? There was a time, and I'm not making that up. That's what it says. It was for us. It's not being narcissistic. It's not being selfish. It's for us. It's for me. And it's for you. And you know, I was raised in a tradition where, you know, you almost even couldn't say that because in the grand scheme of things, when God sent Jesus, he also sent him for himself. Because of this, he glorifies himself. All of that is true. All of that is true. But the reality is, listen, Listen, God could have been perfectly justified in getting rid of his enemies without sending his son to die. He could have just wiped out humanity with one word. But he didn't, because it was for us. Here's what he did. He actually was so wonderful in his strategy. He actually came up with a strategy that says, I am going to put all enemies under my feet, and I'm going to save my people at the same time. Amen. That's how wonderful he is. That's how beautiful he is. And he does it in the form of a child. And he does it in a way that his peace and his rule will never, ever end. And the peace, that wholeness that he offers will never, ever end. You can go to the last slide. And I'm just going to hone in on the last part of this before we go to the table. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do that. Now that sounds like Old Testament, like who says zeal anymore? The Lord of hosts, what does that mean? When you see that, end with this. So this son is given. The son is given. The child is born. He's going to carry everything on his shoulders. By the way, all the actions again here are God's actions. There's what he is doing. The people might be wondering, how is God going to, who's going to accomplish all of this? Because right now we're walking in this deep death darkness. I don't see any light. I don't see anything. How is this going to happen? The passionate love and commitment of the God of angels' armies will do it. How is this going to happen? It's going to happen because of the passionate love of God. That's what the zeal of the Lord of hosts means. It's his passionate love. How are we sure that's going to happen? How are you and I going to be sure that it's really unto us? How are we going to be sure that any of this is going to make it happen? Because there is a God who is the wonderful counselor. He's the mighty God. He's the everlasting Father. He's the Prince of Peace who has a passionate love. And nothing will get in the way of his passionate love because he has the hosts of heavens with him. Amen. That is what Advent is about. That heaven truly came down. The zeal, the passionate love of the God of history. He will do this. We live on the other side of this. How do we know? How do the people know? Because what Isaiah prophesied happened. And there was a baby. And when Isaiah wrote this, he didn't know the mother was going to be Mary and the baby's name was going to be Jesus. No, but they knew a child was coming. And that baby was born. And the passionate love of him and the joy that was set before him, his zeal, his energy, took him directly to a cross. His love took him directly to a cross where his body was broken, his blood was shed. And now, guess what I get to say when we come to this table? Guess what you will hear even as you come forward to partake in this meal? This is the body of Christ broken for you. This is the blood of Christ shed for you. For unto you child's been born. Unto you a son has been given. It's for us. And so when Jesus even gives us words for this meal, he wants us to know that it's for us.